When Timmy's father was finally identified, the story didn't close. It cracked, because once that name was said out loud, the question stopped being about curiosity and started being about consequence. It wasn't who was he anymore. It was what did Lorraine live through while no one was looking. For years, Lorraine Whittaker existed in public conversation as an outline, not a person. She was described in fragments, limited speech, vulnerable, dependent, a woman who moved quietly through a house at the end of a road most people had never driven down. When people talked about her, they talked around her, as if her life were a puzzle instead of a human story. The internet treated her existence like a mystery to solve. But mysteries implied distance. This wasn't distant. This was intimate harm that had no language attached to it. When a name Joe D. Bolin surfaced publicly as Timmy's father, something shifted. Not because the revelation was dramatic, but because it stripped away denial. A name turns speculation into gravity. A name forces the question everyone had been avoiding. How does a woman with serious limitations in speech and communication become pregnant in an environment where she may not have been able to consent, report, or even fully understand what was being done to her? And if she couldn't speak clearly for herself, who was supposed to speak for her? That's where this story really begins. Lorraine's life was not shaped by one moment. It was shaped by silence layered on top of silence. Poverty layered on top of disability. Isolation layered on top of neglect. And long before anyone clicked on a video, those layers were already locked in place. People sometimes assume that if something truly horrific happens, the system will notice, that someone will intervene. That pain creates noise. But Lorraine's pain didn't arrive loudly. It lived inside a woman who struggled to communicate and inside a family that existed far from institutional reach. When you live at the edge of attention, harm doesn't echo. It settles. For decades, Lorraine lived in odd, West Virginia, in conditions that were not temporary and not accidental. They were persistent. No running water. No indoor bathroom. A collapsing structure. Poverty so normalized that survival itself became the daily achievement. In that environment, disability doesn't stand out. It blends in. And when disability blends into poverty, exploitation becomes easier to hide. That's the first truth people struggle to sit with. Lorraine didn't live in a world where help was one call away. She lived in a world where help didn't have a face, a number, or a guarantee. So when people ask why nothing was done sooner, the uncomfortable answer is this: nothing was visible to the people who matter until much later. Before the cameras, Lorraine's life unfolded without witnesses. She wasn't interviewed. She wasn't documented. She wasn't evaluated consistently. There was no paper trail that followed her pain. And pain without documentation doesn't exist as systems built on forms and files. When a name Joe D. Bolin entered the conversation, it didn't just raise questions about Timmy's birth. It raised questions about all the years before it, about how many moments Lorraine lived through without anyone asking her what she needed, what she wanted, or what she feared. Her sister Betty later spoke publicly and described Lorraine as someone who could not protect herself the way others can. Betty alleged that Lorraine was sexually assaulted after being called into a man's house. That is the family's account, shared years later, not a court ruling, not a conviction in the materials people have seen. But even stated carefully, that allegation carries a weight that cannot be brushed aside. Because if Lorraine truly lived with significant communication limitations, then the act described wasn't just violence. It was selection. It was someone choosing a person less able to resist, less able to report, less likely to be believed. And that changes how you look at everything that followed. Because if something like that happened, Lorraine didn't just lose bodily safety in that moment. She lost the chance to be understood about it. Trauma without language doesn't disappear. It embeds. It reshapes behavior, trust, and the way a person moves through the world. When people later watched Lorraine on video, they saw someone quiet, reserved, hesitant. What they didn't see was the context. They didn't see a woman whose life may have taught her that silence was safer than explanation. The second truth emerges here, quietly but relentlessly. Lorraine's silence was not just personal. It was structural. Speech limitations don't exist in isolation. They interact with power, with credibility, with authority. When you can't articulate clearly, your pain becomes easy to dismiss, especially if you live in a place where poverty already lowers expectations. Disability in rural isolation doesn't trigger alarms. It becomes background noise. So Lorraine's life moved forward after Timmy's birth, not with answers, but with endurance. She continued living in the same environment, with the same limits, with a child whose existence itself carried a story she may never have been able to explain. And the world didn't intervene. Years passed. Decades passed. The man identified as Timmy's father died in 2003, long before documentaries, long before YouTube, long before anyone outside that road knew the Whittaker name. That detail matters more than people realize, because it means something crucial. If wrongdoing occurred, accountability was already out of reach by the time public attention arrived. The person at the center of the allegation wasn't going to be questioned, wasn't going to respond, wasn't going to face consequence. What remained was aftermath. A woman with limited voice, a child, a family existing in conditions that should have triggered support long before they triggered spectacle. When the internet eventually arrived, it didn't arrive gently. It arrived with cameras, comments, theories, donations, and judgment. It arrived with people asking questions Lorraine could not answer and making assumptions she could not correct. For some, exposure felt like justice. For Lorraine, it may have felt like invasion. That's the part people rarely acknowledge. Visibility is not automatically rescue, especially for someone whose life has been built around routine and caution. Strangers at the door, cameras in the yard, faces staring, voices asking things she couldn't explain. And then came money, meant to help. But money around vulnerable people attracts interest that isn't always clean. Investigations later revealed allegations of fraud involving funds raised in the family's name. Even sympathy became something someone tried to take. So Lorraine's life includes two eras of harm. One that may have happened quietly decades ago, and one that happened loudly, in public with people watching. Both cost her something. Eventually, Adult Protective Services intervened. Lorraine was removed from the home along with Timmy and Ray. The decision was framed as protection, and in many ways it was. The living conditions were unsafe. The risk was real. But protection comes with loss. Removal meant separation. It meant leaving behind the only world Lorraine had ever known. Even if that world had failed her, it was familiar. Familiarity is powerful, especially for people whose lives have been defined by limited choice. Betty later said she missed them, that she raised them, and both things can be true at once. Care and harm can coexist. Love and failure can share the same roof. That's the hardest truth to sit with. Lorraine's story doesn't offer a clean villain and a clean hero. It offers something more disturbing. A system that didn't see her early enough. A community where neglect became normal. A disability that made speaking dangerous instead of freeing. And when Timmy's father's name was finally spoken, it didn't give closure. It exposed how long Lorraine had been alone inside her own life. In the next part, we'll slow down the timeline and look at how silence stretches across years, how neglect becomes routine, and how a woman can live an entire lifetime without anyone ever truly hearing her. Before you move on, Sit with this question and answer it honestly in the comments. If Lorraine couldn't speak for herself, who do you think should have been listening? Lorraine's story doesn't move in headlines. It moves in years that look uneventful from the outside and unbearable from the inside. To understand what she lived through, you have to understand how time works differently for people like her. When you have limited speech, limited mobility, limited access to institutions, time doesn't mark progress. It marks repetition. The same place, the same people, the same conditions, over and over again. Lorraine didn't have chapters in her life. She had loops. After Timmy was born, nothing structurally changed for her. There was no documented intervention that reshaped her environment. No long-term guardian appointed. No consistent medical oversight. No protected housing. No sustained support that followed her year after year. Instead, she remained where she had always been, in a deteriorating house, in deep rural isolation, dependent on family members who themselves were aging, impoverished, and overwhelmed. This is where the timeline becomes its own tragedy. People often imagine that if a woman gives birth under troubling circumstances, systems automatically engage, that social services appear, that questions get asked, that follow-ups happen. But systems don't operate on instinct. They operate on reports. And reports require language, access, and credibility. Lorraine had none of those. If she couldn't clearly articulate what had happened to her, if she couldn't navigate bureaucratic processes, if she lived far from institutions that regularly check in, then the system didn't fail her once. It never fully met her in the first place. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural reality. In isolated poverty, neglect doesn't arrive as a sudden collapse. It becomes the baseline. When everyone around you is struggling, your suffering doesn't stand out. It blends into the environment. And Lorraine's environment was shaped by generations of scarcity. The Whittaker family history is often discussed in terms of genetics, but genetics alone don't explain outcomes. What magnifies genetic vulnerability is isolation. When people with serious limitations live without consistent professional oversight, small problems compound into permanent conditions. Lorraine's limited speech wasn't treated as an emergency. It was treated as normal for her, which meant her needs were never translated into institutional language. No one wrote them down in a way systems could respond to. So her life moved forward quietly. She lived as a mother without the protections most mothers take for granted. No advocacy, no private space, no reliable health care, no legal literacy, no safety net if something went wrong. And when something did go wrong, there was nowhere for that truth to land. This is the part people underestimate. Trauma doesn't require ongoing violence to remain active. Trauma becomes chronic when there is no relief, no acknowledgement, and no exit. If Lorraine experienced sexual violence, as her sister later alleged, that wasn't an isolated event in her life. It became part of a continuum of vulnerability. A message reinforced by every year that followed. Nothing changes. That kind of message doesn't just hurt emotionally. It reshapes how a person relates to the world. When observers later described Lorraine as quiet, withdrawn, compliant, or childlike, they often missed the deeper reality. Those traits are not personality quirks. They are survival adaptations. Silence becomes safer than explanation. Compliance becomes safer than resistance. Staying small becomes safer than being seen. Now add motherhood to that equation. Lorraine didn't just carry her own limitations. She carried responsibility for a child in an environment that offered almost no support. A child whose existence itself may have been tied to trauma she couldn't name. Imagine what that does to a person's inner world. There's no evidence Lorraine ever received trauma-informed care. No therapy designed for someone with her communication challenges. No safe environment where she could process what had happened to her in a way that made sense to her, not just to professionals. So her pain stayed unprocessed. Years later, when the internet discovered the Whittakers, people were shocked by what they saw. They saw living conditions that looked dangerous. They saw behaviors they didn't understand. They saw poverty frozen in place. What they didn't see was how long that freeze had lasted. This wasn't a sudden decline. It was a slow erosion that had been happening for decades. And here's where another hard truth enters. The absence of visible cruelty doesn't mean the presence of safety. People sometimes defend long-term neglect by pointing out that no one was beating Lorraine, no one was chaining her, no one was overtly torturing her. But safety isn't defined by the absence of extreme violence. It's defined by the presence of care, autonomy, and protection. Lorraine lived without those. She didn't have meaningful choice. She didn't have control over her environment. She didn't have the ability to leave if she wanted to. She didn't have the language to negotiate her needs with authority figures. That's not freedom. That's containment. And containment becomes invisible when it lasts long enough. The longer Lorraine lived this way, the more normalized it became to everyone around her, including possibly herself. When you grow up and grow old inside limits you didn't choose, you stop imagining alternatives. This is why late intervention feels so complicated. When Adult Protective Services finally removed Lorraine, it was because the conditions crossed a threshold that the system could no longer ignore. But by then, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was embedded. Removal brought safety in measurable ways. Clean space, regular meals, supervision, medical access. But it also brought loss that people outside the situation struggled to understand. Familiar voices disappeared. Routines vanished. The physical space her body recognized was gone. For someone with limited communication, sudden change can be terrifying, even when it's protective. This is why the story can't be reduced to simple narratives like rescue or abandonment. It's both protection and rupture. And it's rooted in a timeline that should never have been allowed to stretch this long. People sometimes ask why Lorraine didn't leave. That question assumes leaving was an option. It assumes access, transportation, money, confidence, and a belief that someone else would help. Lorraine had none of that. Her life was shaped by dependency, not because she wanted it, but because no alternative was built for her. That's the cruelty of neglect. It doesn't announce itself. It quietly removes options until the absence of choice feels natural. So when the world finally learned about Lorraine, it wasn't discovering a sudden tragedy. It was discovering the end result of decades without protection. And the timeline tells us something uncomfortable. This wasn't just one failure. It was a sequence of non-interventions. A system that didn't look closely enough. A community that normalized deprivation. A structure that required victims to speak clearly in order to be believed. Lorraine couldn't meet that requirement. And because she couldn't, the years kept passing. In the next part, we're going to examine how exposure changed everything and nothing at the same time. How visibility brought resources but also danger. And how the internet's attention collided with a woman who had never been given the tools to consent to being seen. Before you continue, consider this and respond in the comments. Do you think long-term neglect can be as damaging as a single act of violence? Why or why not? For most of Lorraine's life, invisibility was the rule. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. When the Whittaker family appeared online around 2020, the shift was violent in its own way. Not physically violent, but psychologically abrupt. A woman who had lived for decades outside the public gaze suddenly existed inside millions of screens. And that kind of exposure doesn't arrive gently. The internet did not meet Lorraine where she was. It didn't ask what she needed. It didn't slow down to understand her limits. It arrived at full speed, carrying curiosity, pity, outrage, humor, money, judgment, and entitlement all at once. For viewers, this felt like discovery. For Lorraine, it was intrusion. People often talk about visibility as if it's automatically empowering, as if being seen equals being helped. But visibility without consent, without control, and without protection can become another form of harm. Lorraine didn't choose to tell her story. Her story was told about her. Her face, her home, her disability, her reactions. Everything became content. Strangers analyzed her behavior. Comment sections debated her intelligence. Some people expressed concern. Others expressed fascination. Some expressed mockery. And none of them had to live with the consequences. This is the paradox of viral attention around vulnerable people. The audience feels connected, even invested. But the subject has no agency over how they're perceived, framed, or used. Lorraine had limited speech before the cameras arrived. After the cameras arrived, her silence was filled by other people's interpretations. That matters, because when someone cannot easily correct the narrative being built around them, the loudest voices win. And the loudest voices online are rarely the most careful ones. As attention grew, so did money. Donations came in under the banner of help, repair funds, living expenses, support. And for a moment, it looked like relief, like resources that could finally reach a family that had been living without them. But money in a vulnerable environment is never neutral. When large sums appear suddenly, especially in a household with addiction, poverty, and limited oversight, money doesn't just help. It destabilizes. Reports and public admissions later revealed that some funds intended for the Whittaker family were misused. In at least one documented case, a false claim about a family member's death was used to raise money. That wasn't internet rumor. It was acknowledged as a scam. For Lorraine, this meant something devastating. Even the sympathy directed toward her became something someone else could exploit. She was now vulnerable in two directions at once. From inside her environment, where addiction and chaos intensified, and from outside, where strangers felt entitled to access her life. People drove to the property. They filmed without permission. They treated the home like a destination, a spectacle, a place to see rather than a place where human beings lived. Imagine that experience through Lorraine's nervous system. A woman who already struggled with speech, who lived with fear of outsiders, who relied on routine and familiarity to feel safe, suddenly faced unpredictable visitors and constant disruption. No preparation, no consent, no escape. Exposure doesn't just amplify resources. It amplifies stress. And stress accumulates differently in people with cognitive and communication limitations. It doesn't discharge through conversation or reflection. It stays in the body. Observers later described Lorraine as more withdrawn, more exhausted, more overwhelmed. Some interpreted that as evidence of her condition. Others saw it as passivity. But it's equally plausible that it was overload. When your world goes from small and repetitive to chaotic and watched, your nervous system has no time to adapt, especially if you lack the tools to understand why it's happening. No one sat Lorraine down and explained the internet. No one explained why strangers were suddenly watching her eat, walk, sit, exist. No one explained that the attention would come with consequences. And that lack of explanation is its own form of harm. This is where the idea of help becomes dangerously blurred. Some creators believed they were helping by filming. Some viewers believed they were helping by donating. Some believed attention itself was protection. But none of that replaces safeguards. Safeguards look like boundaries, like consent, like oversight, like professionals trained to work with people who have limited capacity to advocate for themselves. Lorraine didn't get that. Instead, she got exposure layered on top of neglect. And exposure doesn't erase trauma. It can intensify it. There's another uncomfortable truth here. Once a vulnerable person becomes a viral story, it becomes very hard for systems to intervene cleanly. Why? Because everything becomes politicized. Every action is scrutinized. Every delay is questioned. Every decision risks backlash. Agencies that normally operate quietly suddenly face a public spotlight. That doesn't always speed things up. Sometimes it slows them down. Officials must now act carefully, document everything, avoid leaks, and protect privacy in an environment where privacy has already been violated repeatedly. So the internet, which often demands immediate action, can paradoxically make decisive action harder. Lorraine was living inside that contradiction. The more attention the family received, the more complicated intervention became. And yet, eventually, the situation crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. When Adult Protective Services removed Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray, it wasn't because the internet wanted a dramatic ending. It was because the conditions met criteria that demanded action. But removal is not a gentle process. For Lorraine, it meant separation from everything familiar. From her home, from routines, from people she recognized, even if those relationships were flawed. Protection arrived late and abruptly. This is why people struggle emotionally with this part of the story, because the outcome contains no clean victory. Safety came at the cost of rupture, and the rupture itself may carry trauma. For someone with limited speech, sudden separation can feel like abandonment, even when it's meant to protect. The mind may not interpret it as rescue. It may interpret it as disappearance. That doesn't mean removal was wrong. It means removal is never painless. And it means we have to stop treating intervention as an instant fix. Lorraine didn't step into a healed life the moment she left that property. She stepped into a new phase that required patience, consistency, and long-term care. Care that happens quietly, away from cameras. That silence frustrates the public. People want updates, proof, confirmation, happy endings. But confidentiality laws exist for a reason. They protect people like Lorraine from becoming public property again. And here's the hardest part for audiences to accept. Once someone has been exploited through exposure, the most ethical response is less information, not more. Lorraine's healing, if it's happening, is happening in ways the public doesn't get to witness. That's not a failure of transparency. It's a boundary. And boundaries are exactly what Lorraine lacked for most of her life. So when people ask whether the internet saved her, the only honest answer is complicated. The internet brought attention. Attention triggered action. Action brought safety. But the internet also brought chaos, exploitation, and a second wave of trauma. Both things can be true. And this leads to the question we rarely ask. What responsibility does the public have once a vulnerable person becomes visible? Not to watch more closely, not to speculate, not to demand updates, but to step back, to allow professionals to do their work without interference, to resist turning someone's survival into ongoing content. Lorraine lived most of her life unseen. When she was finally seen, it was overwhelming. The goal now should not be to keep watching. The goal should be to let her exist without an audience. In the next part, we're going to confront the hardest tension of all, the idea that protection can still feel like loss. And while Lorraine's story doesn't resolve cleanly, even now, before you move on, consider this and respond in the comments. Can public attention ever truly help someone who cannot consent to it? Or does it always carry a cost? This is where the story becomes hardest to sit with. Because once Lorraine was removed, once the door closed on the house in Odd, Once the cameras were no longer allowed to follow, people expected relief, closure, safety to feel like salvation. But safety doesn't always feel like rescue to the person being protected, especially when protection arrives late, especially when the person has limited language to understand why everything changed. For Lorraine, removal wasn't just relocation. It was rupture. She didn't gradually transition into a new life. She didn't get weeks of preparation or choice. She didn't get to weigh risks and benefits. One day, she was in the only world she had ever known. The next day, she wasn't. And even when a world is harmful, is still your world. People watching from the outside often miss this. They assume that danger erased attachment, that neglect erased familiarity, that fear erased belonging. But human attachment doesn't work that way. Lorraine's life was shaped by repetition. The same land, the same faces, the same routines, the same walls, even as they crumbled. That repetition wasn't comfort in a healthy sense, but it was regulation. It told her nervous system what to expect. When that disappears suddenly, the body doesn't register safety first. It registers loss. This is the paradox of late intervention. The longer someone lives without protection, the harder protection becomes when it finally arrives. And Lorraine lived without it for decades. So removal did two things at once. It reduced physical risk, and it created emotional disorientation. That doesn't mean removal was wrong. It means removal carries a cost that doesn't vanish just because it was necessary. People sometimes ask why Betty, Lorraine's sister, expressed grief after the removal. Why she said, "I raised them." Why she missed them. They interpret that grief as resistance to help, or denial, or control. But grief doesn't require innocence. Grief exists even in broken systems. Betty lived her entire adult life in a caretaker role she didn't fully choose and wasn't supported in. She made promises she didn't have the resources to keep. She stayed when leaving might have been safer, because staying was what she knew. So when the state intervened, it didn't just remove vulnerable adults. It ended an identity. Betty wasn't just losing family members. She was losing the role that had defined her for decades. For Lorraine, the loss was even more primal. She didn't lose a role. She lost orientation. Where am I? Why are these people here? Why can't I go back? For someone with limited speech, those questions don't turn into conversations. They turn into sensations. Confusion, anxiety, withdrawal. This is why people misunderstand silence after removal. They assume quiet means adjustment, but quiet can also mean shutdown. When a person realizes they cannot influence outcomes, the safest response is often stillness. Compliance is mistaken for comfort, and the system isn't always built to distinguish between the two. Another uncomfortable truth lives here. Once someone is removed into protective care, they become protected from the public too, and the public struggles with that. People who followed Lorraine's story feel entitled to resolution. They want proof she's okay. They want updates. They want to see improvement. But those desires center the audience, not the person. Confidentiality laws exist precisely because vulnerable people are often harmed by too much visibility. Lorraine spent years being unseen. Then she was overexposed. The correct response isn't balanced exposure. It's privacy. That can feel unsatisfying. It can feel like abandonment to people who believe watching equals caring. But sometimes caring looks like stepping back. Here's the deeper tension most people don't want to confront. Protection systems are designed to minimize risk, not maximize happiness. They aim to prevent harm. They are not always equipped to restore joy. So even in safer conditions, Lorraine's life may still carry grief, confusion, and longing. Safety doesn't undo the past. It only changes the future's boundaries. This is why the story doesn't end neatly. There is no moment where Lorraine suddenly becomes healed, expressive, joyful, or normal. There is no dramatic transformation arc. There is only stabilization. And stabilization can look painfully ordinary. Regular meals, clean clothes, quiet rooms, limited stimulation, predictable schedules. From the outside, that doesn't feel like justice. But for someone whose life has been shaped by chaos, predictability is mercy. Still, something important is lost when intervention comes late. The chance to preserve continuity. If Lorraine had been supported earlier, she might have transitioned gradually. She might have retained more agency. She might have learned to trust outside help. But early intervention didn't happen. And the cost of that failure doesn't disappear when the system finally steps in. It shows up as separation pain. It shows up as emotional flattening. It shows up as a woman who survives rather than lives. This is why it's dangerous to frame removal as a happy ending. It's not an ending at all. It's a pause in harm. And pauses matter. They save lives. But they don't rewrite history. There's another layer people often avoid. When a vulnerable person is removed, they lose not just their environment, but their voice in the story. Others speak for them now. Professionals write reports. Agencies decide placements. Courts determine access. These systems are necessary, but they also mean Lorraine's internal experience remains largely invisible. She cannot easily say what she wants. She cannot easily say what she misses. She cannot easily say what feels safe. So decisions are made around her. Again, even when those decisions are well-intentioned. This is where the story becomes less about individual villains and more about structural failure. Lorraine didn't just suffer because one person may have harmed her. She suffered because the world she lived in allowed that harm to remain invisible. She suffered because disability plus poverty plus isolation creates a perfect condition for neglect to hide. She suffered because help often arrives only after damage becomes undeniable. And now, she lives with the consequences of both the neglect and the rescue. Both shaped her life. So when people ask, was removal the right choice? The most honest answer is this. It was the only choice left. But the fact that it became the only choice is the real tragedy. Because it means every earlier opportunity to intervene was missed. And missed opportunities don't disappear. They accumulate. They show up as trauma that no court can prosecute because the evidence is time itself. In the final part, we're going to bring all 7 truths together and ask the hardest question of all. What does justice look like when accountability is no longer possible? And what does it mean to honor Lorraine now, when the damage cannot be undone? Before moving on, consider this and respond honestly. Can protection still be called success if it arrives after a lifetime of harm? By the time Lorraine was protected, justice was no longer possible in the way people usually imagine it. There would be no trial that gave her answers, no confession that gave her language, no sentence that returned what was taken. What remained was responsibility. Not legal responsibility, but moral responsibility. Because when accountability is no longer available, honor becomes the only meaningful response left. Honoring Lorraine does not mean retelling her story louder. It does not mean speculating, dissecting, or demanding details the system is right to keep private. And it does not mean turning her pain into proof for arguments online. Honor means recognizing that her life mattered even when no one was watching, that her silence was not consent, that her limitations were not permission, that her survival was not evidence she was unharmed. Honor means accepting an uncomfortable truth. The world failed her long before the internet ever found her. The best thing that can happen now is quiet dignity. A life with fewer eyes on her. Fewer strangers deciding what her story means. More consistency. More safety. Less spectacle. If people truly care about Lorraine, they don't ask for more access. They ask fewer questions. They let protection stay invisible. They allow privacy to be the ending. And they remember this clearly and without excuse. Lorraine didn't need to be famous to deserve safety. She needed protection before silence became her only language.